And a good Friday morning to you. Craig Melvin here. Right now, we are watching a number of critical hurdles to vaccinating more Americans. Kicking off at this minute, that CDC panel meeting about Johnson & Johnson's vaccine. It's decision day about whether to resume emergency use of our country's only single-dose vaccine. Right now, you'll recall, it's on pause. The top concern, cases of rare blood clots among a handful of the millions of people who have gotten that shot. At the same time, the White House COVID-19 response team holding their briefing at this hour, and our nation's top doctors could talk more about another challenge, vaccine hesitancy. In moments, we're on the ground in a number of communities trying to get vaccine doses into people's arms. But for this White House, it's not just a pandemic that's proving a challenge. There's also a reckoning on law enforcement that we have been watching play out across this country for nearly a year now. Right now, we're getting some new comments from the mother of 16-year-old Micaiah Bryant. Micaiah, shot and killed by police in Columbus, Ohio. And while some states are moving on police reform, a number of others are moving on protesters. We'll have more on the wave of new bills targeting protesters in several states coming up in just a few moments. But we want to start with our reporters tracking the race to vaccinate and new challenges with vaccine hesitancy. NBC's Heidi Presbala has her eye on that CDC meeting that I just mentioned that's getting underway about the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. Sam Brock is at a vaccination site in Miami. And Lindsay Reiser is at a vaccination site in New York that's just opened its doors this morning. But Heidi, let me come to you first here. The use of our country's only single-shot vaccine so far hinges on the CDC meeting. Explain what we could expect today as that meeting gets underway and when we could get an answer about reusing that vaccine again.
Good morning, Craig. Not expecting a decision most likely until later this afternoon. They could very well extend the pause, but according to most public health officials, that is not what they're expecting to happen. They're expecting for that pause to be lifted, potentially with a warning label on it about certain at-risk populations, including women with low blood platelet counts, and that is the most prudent way to go forward, given the benefits of this vaccine versus the risks, Craig. However, there are indications that they will have to combine that with an extra public messaging push here, with some individuals saying that they've been paying close attention to what ultimately was a more extended pause than what the acting FDA director initially promised. Take a listen to an individual who I met at a vaccination clinic the other day.
I felt, honestly, when the J&J came out with the one-time deal, I felt it was almost too good to be true. So I was thinking to myself, you know, there's got to be something, there's got to be a catch. Hopefully nothing comes out, but unfortunately it did.
And when that came out, how did you feel?
Back of my head, I told myself, I told you so.
So initial polling, Craig, is showing that this pause has not affected overall vaccine confidence, but the FDA and CDC are going to want to make sure that that stays the case, because this is a critical weapon in our arsenal, like you say, given that it is a one-shot dose and that public health officials were looking specifically at some of the most vulnerable populations to be using this vaccine, such as the homeless, people who are hard to track, individuals who are hospitalized, as well as younger people, Craig.
All right, Heidi there in Washington. Heidi, stand by. Sam, right now, it would seem that vaccine reluctance might be fueling a spring surge there in Florida where you are. What concerns are you hearing about what Floridians could be facing?
Craig, good morning. Good to be with you. We've been talking from this site, actually, on your show for weeks now, and there is the eyeball test to note here. As the sign suggests over my shoulder, this is a federally supported vaccine site. This does not look like what it did weeks or certainly months ago, Craig, when we were seeing eligibility expanding to different brackets of people, to those 16 and older. You know, it kind of looks like a trickle over my shoulder right now. I will say this. It's been at least 3,500 people vaccinated at this site and a couple of pop-up sites for the last several weeks. Those are are good numbers, but the red flags, Craig, that we're hearing right now are the phasing out of first doses and focusing in of just second doses as a result of declining demand. Now, over my shoulder, this site here is continuing first doses right now only because of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine pause. Otherwise, it was going to go exclusively to second. But the two largest public nonprofit hospital healthcare systems in South Florida right now, Jackson Health and Broward Health, are both ending first doses. For Jackson, that's going to happen in a week. For Broward, this is the last day you can get those shots. That's what's concerning folks within the community right now, because we know that the vaccination rate in South Florida is about 40% or so. That is not what any public health officials here feel is good, is adequate, is where we need to be to get to higher levels of vaccination. So they have a campaign called I Did It, involving public figures, folks who are just talking about their personal experiences in Miami-Dade and in Broward, trying to get folks to feel comfortable, because as Heidi was saying, we're looking at communities right now that are most vulnerable, that might be impacted by the J&J pause. That's who officials here are trying to reach right now, specifically communities of color. And the numbers are good, but they could be a whole lot better as we look to trying to get to herd immunity. Craig?
Yeah, it's all right. Sam Brock there in Miami-Dade County. Lindsay Reiser, let's turn to you here. And a bit of news coming out of New York City. In just the last half hour, a New York City councilman tweeting that all city-run vaccination sites are open to walk-ins of all ages as of today. That would seem significant, Lindsay. And you've also got the American Museum of Natural History that has turned into a mass vaccination site as well.
Yeah, Craig, I know you got your first shot on the plaza, which is cool. I'll give you that. But this is pretty cool, too. And that new development does include this location, the Museum of Natural History. Who wouldn't want to get their vaccine underneath that iconic 94-foot-long blue whale inside? It's been pretty steady all morning. They're hoping to fill 1,000 appointments a day when they're open here. And this is coming as we're seeing some pretty positive indicators in the city. Cases, hospitalizations, and deaths are all down. Right now, nearly half of all New York City residents have gotten at least one shot. And the mayor is trying to use vaccinations as an incentive. As that vaccination rate climbs, restrictions can come down. Of course, we're not looking at that outdoor mask mandate being lifted until July at the earliest. But I spoke with a woman who got her first shot underneath that whale today. Let's listen to what she told me.
I was walking in the park on Monday, and two girls came up to me and they asked me, do you want to take the vaccine? I said, sure. And so here I am.
What was it like being underneath the blue whale and getting your shot?
Surreal, because I have been in this museum so many times. I never thought I would take a vaccine right here.
So she was a little hesitant. She said she wanted to wait to get the vaccine until she found out a little bit more about the side effects and its safety and efficacy. But as you just heard, she was walking through the park. People came to her. It seems like for her it was meant to be, Craig.
Yeah, and Lindsay, I would contend, yes, the plaza vaccination was pretty cool, but getting it underneath that blue whale there at the Natural History Museum, also pretty cool. In fact, we've got some video of workers there putting the bandage on that massive blue whale there. This is some video that the museum put out. And here's the thing, folks, if the blue whale can get the shot, you can too. Thank you, Sam Brock. Thank you, Heidi. And be sure to catch Lindsay Reiser weekend morning starting at 6 a.m. Eastern right here on MSNBC. I want to turn now to Dr. Amish Adalja, excuse me, Dr. Adalja. Dr. Adalja is a senior scholar at the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security at the Bloomberg School of Public Health. Good to have you back, Doctor. Let's start with the CDC Advisory Committee meeting. Do you think that they will ultimately decide to lift that pause on the J&J vaccine, but perhaps with the warning about the potential for blood clots similar to what we saw happen in Europe?
That's exactly what I anticipate will happen, that they will weigh the risk-benefit and look at this very rare side effect and say that the benefits of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine far outweigh this risk. And what will happen likely is a warning label, very similar to what happened with the European regulator just earlier this week. And hopefully we'll be able to resume the Johnson & Johnson vaccine because it is a very critical vaccine, one and done, no storage requirements, something that's going to be really critical to getting those hard-to-reach populations vaccinated.
Are you at all concerned that when that does happen, if that does happen, that folks are going to be a bit more reluctant about getting that particular vaccine?
I am concerned. If you look at the polling, it seems that people that were already kind of on the fence about this vaccine are more so on the fence because this is another negative headline. Johnson & Johnson has had several negative headlines with manufacturing, with people fainting, with the Detroit mayor, for example, misinterpreting efficacy data, and the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops attacking this vaccine. All of that really sticks in people's minds. And I do think it's going to be harder to restart this at the same pace as before. Hopefully I'm wrong. Hopefully people will want to get it. But I do think if you look at what happened with AstraZeneca in Europe after they resumed their pause, they did see vaccine hesitancy there. But hopefully we're able to overcome it. Again, like I said, this is the vaccine that I used to recommend to people because it was one and done and easy to get. And I think that, the pause is going to do some damage to this, but it also is an example of our system working well, that such a rare side effect was caught. But again, people don't think about that. They think about the negative headlines, and I think we'll have to really be proactive about really extolling the benefits of this tremendous vaccine.
Dr. Indulge, as we're having this conversation, the White House COVID-19 response briefing is going on, and apparently just a few moments ago during that briefing, there's Dr. Walensky right there, head of the CDC. They announced 2 new mass vaccination sites, federal vaccination sites in the state of Kentucky, 2 new ones. Sounds great, but how do we get folks there? How do we get more people to actually go to these vaccination sites and get that shot in the arm?
It's increasingly going to be harder. We're sort of hitting a wall because the people that were eager to get vaccinated, healthcare workers like myself, high-risk individuals, nursing home residents, they've already been highly vaccinated. Now we're moving into the general population where the risks of COVID-19 may be a little bit lower, so we've got to do more persuasion. It is a great step forward to make this as easy as possible to do. Walk-in clinics where you don't have to have an appointment, where you don't have to go through multiple websites and putting your social security number in and all your insurance information. All of those barriers are starting to melt away, and that's going to make it easier. But I do think we're going to have to really be aggressive with telling people that this vaccine is something that's going to improve their individual personal life. This is the way they get their life back. This is the way they enjoy activities free from the risk of COVID-19. And we have to really sell people on the benefits of this great piece of technology that is the vaccine. And it's going to be slow now. I think it's going to take some time because of where we are. In certain states, certain demographic groups, we're seeing people not ordering vaccines because the demand is starting to go down. We're no longer supply constrained. We are demand constrained, and we really have to detail people on the great benefits that this vaccine offers to their personal lives.
The CDC also reportedly, Dr. Indulge, looking into revising its mask guidance, as some health experts are increasingly calling for mask restrictions to be eased for outdoor activities, if not lifted altogether. Right now, nearly 90 million Americans fully vaccinated. We're still averaging more than 62,000 new cases a day, roughly 700 deaths a day as well. What do you make of lifting mask rules on outdoor activities right now? Is now the time to do that?
I do think it is the time to do that. We want our public health guidance to reflect the best science. And what we've learned throughout this pandemic is that outdoor transmission is extremely rare. In most circumstances, when you're outdoors, you can naturally social distance. You've got a lot of ventilation. And that's not a place where masks are going to have much benefit. Obviously, if you're in an outdoor concert or at a political rally or crowded together outside at a party, there may be a role for masks there. But for walking down the street away from everybody else, or hiking, or riding a bicycle, or jogging, it doesn't really make sense to have people wear masks. And we want the public to realize that the guidance is based on science, and maybe lifting this outdoor mask mandate will start to get people to be less acrimonious over this whole debate over masks, where masks are really important in certain situations, especially indoor situations with unvaccinated people. And we want people to continue to wear masks in those situations. So I think this will, do a lot of good towards teaching people that wear masks are most beneficial.
Dr. Amish Indulge. Dr. Indulge, thank you, sir. Thanks as always. Enjoy your weekend if you can. And this afternoon, by the way, be sure to watch my colleague Ayman Mohideen. He's going to have a conversation with Dr. Anthony Fauci about today's CDC meeting and about that Johnson & Johnson vaccine. Again, Ayman and Dr. Fauci, 3 o'clock Eastern, only on MSNBC. And this morning, new developments in the deadly shooting of 16-year-old Ma'Khia Bryant by police in Columbus, Ohio. New comments to NBC News from Ma'Khia's mother. Next. Also, while some states are re-examining police reform, other states are passing bills targeting something else entirely. Protesters. In Florida, a new bill actually makes it easier for drivers to avoid liability if they hit a protester. Coming up, more on what's happening there and efforts like it popping up across the country. From the mother of 16-year-old Micaiah Bryant. Micaiah Bryant, of course, the young girl fatally shot by police in Columbus, Ohio, while authorities say she was holding a knife. We're learning new details about the officer involved as well. NBC's Maura Barrett is in Columbus. She's outside police headquarters there following these new developments. So, Maura, let's start with the mother here. What is she saying this morning, and what are we also learning about the officer involved?
Craig, Micaiah's mother, Paula, says that this incident was extremely out of character for her daughter, and she's feeling extremely heartbroken this morning. Our team spoke with her just yesterday. I want you to hear some of that conversation.
The pain of losing a child is something that no parent wants to go through. I'm still processing this. I'm still mourning. Micaiah was a sweet little girl. She didn't deserve what happened to her.
Now, her mother maintains that Micaiah was defending herself in this apparent knife fight with those two other females we see in the body camera video that the officer was responding to. Her teacher speaking out as well, saying that she had had a troubled childhood but was working to build a better future, actually saying that the day that she died, he received an email from her detailing her 5-year plan about going to college and ultimately opening her own business. Now, these are all details we're getting as the investigation is ongoing, and we're learning more about the officer involved, Nicholas Reardon. He is 23 years old and had been employed at the Columbus Police Department since 2019. He actually is the son of the former sergeant who used to train recruits here in Columbus. But this is as there's a tense relationship between the community here in Columbus and the police department. I want to show you some of these numbers. Over the last 6 years, 34 people have been shot and killed by law enforcement. 23 of them were black and 7 were teenagers. So Micaiah, just the latest in this string as the community members here protesting peacefully the past few nights, but calling for police reform. And the attorney general here saying that he promises a fair and transparent investigation. Looking ahead, the community plans to rally for Micaiah's justice at the State House during the day tomorrow. Craig.
Maura Barrett for us there on the ground in Columbus. Maura, thank you. Another story that we're following on this Friday morning, the fight to make Washington, D.C. our nation's 51st state. A bill now heads to the Senate after the House passed the D.C. statehood bill on Thursday. Our senior Washington correspondent, Hallie Jackson, closely following this looming battle.
For 60 years, 50 states, but Congress is now one step closer to adding another.
D.C. statehood is an idea whose time has come.
The House passing a bill that would make Washington, District of Columbia, the state of Washington Douglas Commonwealth, honoring abolitionist Frederick Douglass. The mayor would become the new governor, and the 700,000 plus people living in D.C. who already pay the most federal taxes per capita would get federal voting rights, including 2 new senators. That would almost certainly mean 2 more Democrats, given D.C.'s political leanings, with the GOP intensely opposed to statehood.
Democrat support is really about of H.R. 51. Democratic partisanship, Democrat power.
Some Republicans argue D.C. is too small.
D.C. wouldn't even qualify as a singular congressional district.
It does have more people than Vermont or Wyoming. Some have argued D.C.'s not Wyoming.
Wyoming is a well-rounded, working-class state.
Democrats blast that as thinly veiled racism.
I had no idea there were so many syllables in the word white.
And one Republican argued this.
D.C. would be the only state without an airport, without a car dealership.
D.C. does have car dealerships, and the Constitution doesn't mention those anyway. As for the Founding Fathers, some conservatives say they never intended that the nation's capital become a state.
Anybody who knows a law book from a J. Crew catalog knows it's unconstitutional.
There's nothing in the Constitution that says the district cannot become a state.
If that happens, D.C. would have the highest percentage of black residents in the country. Top Democrats frame statehood as a civil rights issue, and supporters include the Biden administration, about half of all voters nationwide, and a lot of folks who call the district home.
It makes me feel as if I am being robbed of a right that I should have.
It feels that my voice in Congress is
not represented.
That was NBC's Howard Jackson reporting there. My colleague Chuck Todd, moderator of Meet the Press, made an interesting point this morning on Today. Chuck points out that he thinks that the path to D.C. statehood could actually run through Puerto Rico. The governor of Puerto Rico has told him that he wants to work with the district on statehood, and he says in many ways there's more openness on the right, especially among Florida's 2 Republican senators on Puerto Rico statehood. Something we'll be watching very closely here over the next few months and years, I'm sure. Child care, paid leave, universal pre-K education. That's central to President Biden's latest pandemic proposal. The White House is calling it the American Families Plan. What we're learning about how the president plans to pay for it. Also, the financial struggles for families because of this pandemic, far from over. Food insecurity remains a major problem a year into this. NBC's Ellison Barber is going to take a firsthand look at one food bank that's helping up to 2,000 households just today. That's next. More, and Monica, a big part of today's agenda, as we understand it, is going to be carbon emissions specifically. What's the administration's plan there?
That's right, Craig. If day one was all about announcing goals and trying to set some benchmarks, day two was more about how to achieve some of those more lofty objectives. And that's why you had President Biden really touting some international partnerships, announcing that the U.S. is going to be working with countries like Sweden, the United Arab Emirates, other places on a variety of different sectors in order to try to really cut those greenhouse gas emissions. And you also heard some new commitments from world leaders following suit from what the president announced yesterday, which was the whole hope and aim and goal of this 2-day conference hosted by the U.S. on climate. So we saw Israel and South Korea, for instance, making new commitments when it comes to coal, in addition to some others, which turned heads a little bit when the president in his remarks actually praised Russia's Vladimir Putin for trying to commit to carbon dioxide removal. That's something where the U.S. actually sees as an opportunity to working with Russia. But that word, opportunity, was really the theme of today, because the president is essentially trying to pitch all of the economic benefits that can come from trying to meet these goals, essentially all of the jobs that can be created by his own infrastructure plan. And that's why he also had Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg, who spoke as a part of the speakers, again, trying to lay out what they view as the benefits of not just job creation here, but also working on some of these really, really challenging climate issues. So this is somewhere where the president can try to sell some things in terms of what he wants to do here at home that he wants to argue and believes can also benefit the globe as a whole, Craig.
Monica, let's turn to another significant development as well. We now know that the president is planning to unveil his American Families Plan during that speech to Congress next week. What more do we know about that plan?
Well, this is what the White House is saying is essentially phase 2 to the infrastructure and jobs bill. So we know what's in that. We already know about the giant $2.2 trillion price tag, for instance. But for this next bill, and what really we don't know all the contours and details of it yet, officials are telling us essentially that this is more to do with the human infrastructure. When you think about the child tax credit for care, or you think about universal pre-kindergarten, free community college, this package would be more like $1.5 trillion, we understand. And again, we should point out the White House hasn't finalized any of these details, and they don't want to get ahead of it because they want the president to be the one to announce the specifics next week in this major address to Congress. But in terms of how this is going to be paid for, we know that infrastructure and jobs, at least in the proposal for now, would be covered by an increase in the corporate tax rate, though the percentage is still subject to debate. When it comes to this next phase in the American Families Plan, as the White House is calling it, potentially one of the ways would be to increase taxes on the wealthiest Americans and investors, though the White House has stressed repeatedly that this president does not plan to raise taxes on anyone who makes less than $400,000 a year. Craig.
It sounds like perhaps capital gains taxes could be going up for a lot of folks in this country. Monica Alba at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue for us on this Friday. Right now, a lingering and urgent toll of this pandemic is the struggle that so many Americans are facing to just simply get food on their tables. For more than a year now, we've seen long lines of people at food banks. Millions have had to turn to these food banks for They've turned to the government for unemployment assistance. They've turned to the food banks for food. And while this week we saw new unemployment claims continue to fall, CNBC is reporting that about 8 million fewer Americans are working than before the pandemic. NBC's Allison Barber is at a food drive at the Atlanta Motor Speedway in Hampton, Georgia for us. What are you seeing and hearing from folks there, Allison?
Hey, Craig. Yeah, so the Atlanta Community Food Bank has enough food here to feed some 2,000 households. You can see they're moving cars through here as quickly as they can and filling the back of the trucks, whatever it may be, with different food items. So they've been doing this for a good hour and a half now, so the lines are starting to let up a little bit. But people lined up a good 2 hours or so before this even opened to get food. One of the first questions I asked one of the organizers of this food drive, have you seen the numbers drop in months? It feels like things are starting to get a little more hopeful in the pandemic, but she says no, their numbers have stayed the same, consistent throughout the pandemic. They are still seeing high numbers of families needing to come and get food. We spoke to one woman who was waiting in line this morning, and she said things have been so hard, and without a food drive like this, her family might not be able to eat. Listen here. Is this something you ever thought that you would need to do, be in a food line?
No, not at all.
How hard is it to say, yeah, I need a little bit of help right now?
It's hard because I'm usually an independent person, but right now it's just hard.
The Atlanta Community Food Bank says that they are distributing 50% more food than they did in March of 2020. They say that is not just this month. Again, they say that has been consistent throughout the pandemic. They work, Craig, in about 29 different counties in Georgia, and they say food insecurity since the pandemic started has increased by about 31% among children. In those counties, they say that they're looking at about 1 in 5 children facing food insecurity since this pandemic began. Craig.
It really is still hard to get your head around the fact that you've got so many of our fellow Americans that simply can't afford food. Allison Barber there in a state that she knows well, the state of Georgia. Allison, thank you. Americans all over this country have taken to the streets since George Floyd's murder to push for police reform. So why then are we seeing new bills targeting the protesters? We'll dig into the wave of anti-protest measures making their way through the states. First, though, fighting fire with fire, literally. Scientists in California say smaller fires may be key to preventing those massive, devastating wildfires. NBC's Jacob Ward got an inside, up-close look at a really fascinating process. He's going to join us next. Right now, California is getting ready for another extreme fire season, and scientists believe it's time to fight fire with fire, quite literally, actually. An experimental forest in the Sierra Nevada is a living laboratory for fire. It's where scientists are studying the best way to thin out vegetation that could otherwise be a time bomb for California. NBC's Jake Ward is in Vacaville. It's an hour north of San Francisco. It's where one of the state's largest wildfires happened last year. And Jake, you got some unprecedented access to this process. Walk us through how it works.
Well, Craig, I'm standing here in the site of the LNU fire. It was, as you say, one of the largest wildfires in the history of California. And unfortunately, that's the language we have to use year after year in modern history. But now scientists are saying that to avoid this kind of destruction, we may need to actually let fire do what it wants.
High in the Sierra Nevada mountains, we watched this team set fire to the forest floor. As a news crew used to record-breaking fire seasons, it scared us to death.
So I look at this and I think this could get out of control at any moment. But you look at this and you know this is
That's right, yeah. It's virtually impossible for this to become a wildfire.
Rob York is a professor of forestry at UC Berkeley.
We're going to keep an eye out to make sure the fire is where we want it to be.
His office is this experimental forest in Northern California, where his team studies the benefits of fire.
It's not that we don't want fire, it's that we want the right type of fire.
You and I probably think of forests the same way, right? As a dark, shadowy environment. Well, it turns out this is actually what it's supposed to look like. 300 feet of visibility in every direction. I would get a sunburn here if I didn't wear a hat. That is the role of fire in making a healthy forest.
Here's a 1915 photograph from the Sierras. Here's the same place in 2002. Photos show that fire has always been part of California. But 20th century humans began fighting fires, and too well. This is a forest that hasn't burned in years. It's lush and green, but that makes it a ticking time bomb. Most of California's forests look like this. And drought and high temperatures in 2020 turned all this fuel into the worst fire season in modern history, burning a record 4 million acres and destroying thousands of homes and other buildings. The fires turned Bay Area skies an apocalyptic all the way across the continental U.S. and increased hospital admissions by as much as 10%. Experts say so-called prescribed burns, small intentional fires to thin out the forests, could prevent those mega fires. The governor's new budget sets aside $1 billion toward wildfire prevention and specifically calls for prescribed burns.
When people are driving down the road up here or in the forest and they see the smoke, I want them to think, oh, cool, that's a prescribed fire.
Researchers here just finished burning this portion of the experimental forest.
This is actually the effects that we intended and we like to see.
How do I know the difference between this and the devastation of a wildfire? This looks damaged in a bad way.
If you just look up at the overstory trees, our big trees here, they're green and they're fine. We're not going to see a lot of damage in our larger overstory trees.
In fact, the soil here is better for new trees than it was before the burn.
Are you hopeful that people are beginning to learn we shouldn't just put out all fire every time?
I think we can get there with education and just with more people using fire and people getting used to it.
The question now, in a state of nearly 40 million people, can we afford to give the natural fire cycle the land it needs each year?
Now, Craig, native peoples have known for generations that you can, in fact, grow things back better in an environment that's been burned. You can already see that kind of growing back happening around me. The problem, of course, is that native peoples would then move on once they had set those fires. We set down homes in areas like these. And so the real question, Craig, is how are we going to live with the natural fire cycle and modern civilization in the same picture? Craig?
That was a really good story, Jake. I learned a lot. Jake Ward there for us in Vacaville, California. Thanks so much for that. Immunity for people who drive into protesters, bigger penalties for taking down Confederate monuments, and blocking protesters from getting state jobs or unemployment benefits. Those are just some of the bills that target protesters that Republican state lawmakers have introduced over the past year. We're going to take a closer look at what's behind it and the legal challenges they face. Next. In the aftermath of the Derek Chauvin trial, many cities are taking a closer look at policing and racial injustice, but several states are setting their sights instead on protest. In Florida, on Monday, Republican Governor Ron DeSantis signed what he dubbed an anti-riot bill. Among other things, it prevents jailed protesters from bailing out until they've appeared before a judge. It ups the penalties for toppling monuments, and it makes it easier for drivers to escape liability if they hit a protester with their car. Florida's Republican House Speaker Chris Sprowls was quoted in the New York Times saying, quote, "We weren't going to allow Florida to become Seattle. We were not going to allow Florida to become Portland." Joining me now, one of the reporters on that New York Times story, politics reporter Reed Epstein. I'm also joined by Charles Coleman. Charles is a civil rights attorney. He's also a former prosecutor. Gentlemen, a big thanks to both of you. Reed, let me start with you. It's not just Florida here. Your piece also looks at Oklahoma and Iowa, a few other states that are considering similar legislation. Walk us through your reporting. Give us a fuller understanding of the landscape, if you will.
Well, Craig, this all stems from last summer and the protests following the George Floyd killing by the Minneapolis Police Department that gripped the country. And what we saw is a lot of Republican lawmakers looked at those protests and saw them as as both organizing tools for Democratic politicians, but also as not necessarily as peaceful protests, as 96% of them were, but as riots that damage cities. And they sort of tell a false tale about what happened during those protests all of last year. And their attempt to rectify that has been pieces of this legislation, things like immunity for drivers that strike protesters, or far harsher penalties for people convicted of rioting offenses, and frankly, lowering the bar of what constitutes a riot under various state laws.
Charles, civil rights attorney, has already filed a federal lawsuit against that Florida law I just mentioned. How strong of a case do you think they have?
Well, Craig, I think they have a very strong case, and quite frankly, I expect us to see additional challenges, and this, quite frankly, may end up in front of the Supreme Court at the end of the day. These are pieces of legislation which begin to trample on one of the most fundamental rights that we enjoy here in America, and that is the right to free speech, the right to protest, the right to assemble lawfully and say whatever it is that's on your mind. And I think that this is a clever marketing strategy that is being employed by some of the legislators because if you note, this didn't occur after January 6th on the White House. On the Capitol. This didn't occur after Charlottesville. It's only in the wake of this election, of the protests that we've seen across the country over the past year, that this has now become a priority. And so I will leave it to you and other viewers to ask themselves, what is the common thread here that would cause this to be a priority now that wasn't during the times that I just mentioned?